you could state your name and what you do.
I'm David Iannucci. I'm retired as of January 1st, but I'm formerly a lot of things, including working as Chief Legislative Officer and Deputy Legislative Officer for Governor William Donald Schaefer, Secretary of what's now called the Maryland Department of Commerce, and then a long career in working last 14 years in Prince George's County running economic development, most recently for Angela Alsobrooks, our new United States Senator. But I'm retired as of January 1st.
Well, let's start before your work with Governor Schaefer. What did you do before working for Governor Schaefer?
Well, I'm a lawyer, University of Maryland Law School graduate in 1979, and my first job, and for a 7-year job, was working in Annapolis as a legislative staffer. And I ran the Maryland General Assembly's bill drafting unit for 7 years. I was in charge every year of supervising about 22 attorneys and drafting about 3,500 bills a year. And I would review those, edit those, draft many of them myself. So I ran bill drafting for the legislature. And that's when Alan Rifkin actually spotted me, picked me out, and asked me to join newly elected William Donald Schaefer's legislative office.
And what was William Donald Schaefer like?
Well, I miss him a lot, and I greatly admire him. He was really highly respected at the time, especially for being one of the great mayors in the United States, mayor of Baltimore City, of course. The book In Search of Excellence, I think, is actually dedicated to him from a managerial standpoint. And he had been easily elected governor, but it took him a while to adjust to the Maryland General Assembly versus the Baltimore City Council. And he had very strong opinions. He was very passionate, very concerned about just people. That was a big one of those things. And from a management standpoint, he was known for his phrase, "do it now," which is a kind of institutional impatience. And that's really imbued my whole professional career, which is kind of getting things done right away and avoiding delay and fighting against delay and bureaucracy and so forth. So he was a very impatient man, and you also knew it when he was unhappy. He also knew it when he was happy, by the way.
Do you have any specific memories of working for him?
Many. He was extraordinary in his praise for staff who he thought were performing well. But he could be equally as extraordinary in his unhappiness with an individual who might not have performed. And there were many times I spent a lot of time with him, and I knew what he wanted, or if I got on the wrong track, he got me back on the right track real quickly in terms of what he wanted. And he was in a lot of ways he was a very private man in a very public job. And that was kind of one of I think, the contradictions of William Donald Schaefer. But he could be the biggest ham in the world, but in a lot of ways he was an introvert in some strange fashion.
Did you ever see him stressed out about Camden Yards? And if you did, what was he like?
For Camden Yards, actually, I would say he was probably one of the more relaxed people of all time. I think he had confidence all along that the bill was going to pass. There were probably times when I didn't or wasn't so sure, especially in the middle of filibusters and some really difficult committee hearings. And I think Alan Rifkin would probably agree. We spent some time kind of worrying about things, but there was I think there was a quiet confidence at the end of the day that the legislation was going to pass, but it turned out to be probably a little harder than we expected.
So walk me through what was that legislation you're talking about? Like, if you could just describe all.
Yeah, and let me go back. So when I was running bill drafting for the Maryland legislature, there was a delegate named Bill McCaffrey from Prince George's County, actually. He was a real sports enthusiast. And remember, the Colts had left, the Baltimore Colts had left, so there was that kind of trauma in the Baltimore area. Edward Bennett Williams, who had been the owner of the Washington Redskins and one of America's great trial attorneys, had bought the Baltimore Orioles. And there was a nervousness in the Baltimore community that he was going to relocate the Orioles to Washington, D.C., which had lost the Washington Senators in 1971 with probably the worst owner of all time, a guy named Bill Short. So there was this nervousness about, we've lost the Colts, we got a Washington, D.C. owner of the Orioles, we could lose them as well. And so even many Maryland politicians from around the state were focused on that. Bill McCaffrey had me draft a bill to create a Maryland Sports Authority, was just kind of a concept to get something in place to kind of potentially manage what was understood to be the deficiencies of Memorial Stadium, the very serious deficiencies of Memorial Stadium, and trying to figure out what the future was. Now, that legislation didn't go anywhere, but it was a complex piece of legislation that you had to follow certain guidelines in terms of creating a state entity. And someone who's really one of my closest friends, Ben Bialik, was chief legislative officer for Governor Hughes. And he and I are still very close friends. We actually go to Nationals games all the time. He called me up and asked if he essentially could borrow that template. And he used that template to create what became the Maryland Stadium Authority's legislation. That would have been 85 or so, or 85 or 86. So that was the template. It was a kind of a structure of an entity. And then jump ahead to Schaefer being elected, the commission comes back with a recommendation to build 2 stadiums, and that was one of the controversies, replace Memorial Stadium not with a multi-purpose stadium, but with 2 separate stadiums, a baseball-only stadium and a football-only stadium. And remember, there's no football team at the time. And I think a lot of people were surprised by that now incredibly wonderful and important decision to go in that direction. And so jump ahead to Schaefer making the decision to support this legislation, to support this recommendation, and working with Alan Rifkin and Governor Schaefer and Lieutenant Governor Steinberg, we had to put together the new legislation to create to expand the authority of the Maryland Stadium Authority to issue bonds to pay for a football stadium and what it was going to be structured like, how it was going to be financed, and we should talk about the financing issues as well. So it was a kind of complex legislative drafting process that really had its origin 3 or 4 years earlier, and then ended up in the legislation that got introduced in the session when Camden Yards passed.
So, from what we heard from Rifkin, was that there's multiple sites for the potential new baseball park. Was it Buddha was one of the
Hank Buddha, yeah.
Commission, and
Yeah.
there's another one, and the Mannequin Commission.
Man, yeah.
How were those taken into account?
It really, in my mind, came down to Lansdowne versus Camden Yards. I mean, I think there were others discussed. It might even like have been a Laurel site or something, but it really was Lansdowne, which is just kind of south of the city. More, it might be in Baltimore County. I'm not 100% sure, but it's kind of the idea was situated more between Washington and Baltimore. And it was Schaefer said, no, it's going to be a downtown stadium. We're going to build this stadium downtown. And I don't remember that being a long debate in his part. I think it was very clear to him he was going to have this new stadium built in Baltimore City. Now, I'd gone to the University of Maryland Law School and had commuted for years from where I lived in College Park up and had driven past what was an industrial park. So I knew the site very well. I mean, it was an existing industrial park that I would go on the way to the law school. And that became that decision was made pretty quickly. There was very little opposition, by my recollection. Maybe a few suburban legislators thought it should be more situated south, but that was a Schaefer decision. The new stadium is going to be in Baltimore City.
So what did Edward Bennett Williams and the Orioles think about all of this? Like, because you said earlier about, well, he didn't directly say he wanted a stadium. Yeah. He just kind of like, we want something new.
So remember, kind of the culture is you've got a Washington, D.C. lawyer who owns the Baltimore Orioles. There's no Washington baseball team. And what's the future? And everyone knew that Memorial Stadium was obsolete. Although they were drawing huge crowds, by the way, in those years. They were drawing 3.5, 4 million people to Memorial Stadium with all its deficiencies. And what Williams kept on saying was Memorial Stadium is inadequate. I'm not going to sign anything more than a 1-year lease at Memorial Stadium. He was very coy, though. He never once, and he probably claimed to the day he died, I never asked for a new stadium, potentially until that very last hearing. So there was that kind of unease. So he's not signaling that not saying, build me a new stadium and I will sign a long-term lease. He's just saying, I'm not signing a long-term lease at Memorial Stadium. And that drove a lot of people crazy.
Yeah, so shift back to more Schaefer stuff. What was your daily schedule like working for him?
Well, the governor there was a 4-person legislative office. Alan was the chief at that point. I was deputy. He left. He was there for 18 months, and I was chief for 5 years after that. And we didn't have just one bill. We didn't just have Camden Yards. We had, there's probably about a 25 bill package that the governor introduced that session, from everything from, in drunk driving to creating new state agencies and the correction system, and just economic development and health issues. So this was just one of the bills that we were chasing and monitoring, but it was clearly the most high profile bill of all. But it was every week you would start on Monday, and the governor would have a press conference. The legislature would meet that in the evening, and we in the legislative office would plan our schedule to draft testimony for the various hearings that we would have during the week, to try to anticipate the question, to line up our witnesses, line up our advocates, meetings with legislators on a regular basis to pitch the governor's proposals. And that was kind of, for the 90 days, it was probably one of the most intense jobs I've ever had. I mean, you were in the foxhole with bullets shooting over your head every day of the week in that job. So make sure you ask me about the funding of this when we get to that at some point. But that was it. And the legislation was introduced pretty early in the session, I recall. And there were a total of 3 legislative hearings, and they were. And I remember sitting with Alan, with many legislators, where in order to get their vote on Camden Yards, there were roads that were promised, and highways that were expanded, and high schools that were built, and other projects to kind of do the give and take of politics to line up the votes. And it was and then we would bring people up to talk to Governor Schaefer where we needed his vote. And I remember some of those meetings were pretty historic and pretty amazing as well, because sometimes Governor Schaefer, despite his reputation, wouldn't press a person. He wouldn't go in for the close or something like that.
So for that legislative package, would you say, because you said Camden Yards was at top of mind, like how much a priority really was Camden Yards in that legislative package?
Well, for me, it was the most important bill of all. I mean, in my portfolio legislation, and I can't even remember the other bills I was chasing. I probably had half a dozen other bills. But to me, I knew from the day one it was going to be the most important, the highest profile bill of anything that we were going to do. And that, in a lot of ways, Schaefer's success in that first year as governor was going to be measured by, did the Camden Yards legislation pass? And the idea was it had to pass. It was going to pass, although there were scary moments.
So what were some of those scary moments, if you don't mind sharing?
Well, it was trying to come up with the votes we needed to get it, particularly out of the Senate, as I recall. That was the hardest number of votes, and there was a filibuster potential in the Senate that doesn't exist on the House. And I think we needed 33 or 34, 35 votes. Even the majority was 24. You needed to break a filibuster. There were a lot of questions that are going to be asked about the Commanders' new stadium in Washington, D.C. The question of public financing for a stadium to be done by a multimillionaire, or even so forth, and the whole issue of the role of public financing in a stadium for essentially a private business, and then there were people who simply said, "I'm not from Baltimore. I'm from the Eastern Shore. And I don't care about a stadium in Baltimore. It's irrelevant to my constituents. How do I tell someone from Somerset County or Garrett County that we're voting to spend state money on a stadium?" That was pretty intense. There was one senator who really angered me by misstating some things, it was very clear that we were marketing the new stadium as an open air, baseball only, natural grass stadium. And it was going to be this first stadium designed in this area just for baseball. It was not going to be a multi-purpose stadium. I can't emphasize how big a change that was at the time. Memorial had been multi-purpose. RFK, of course, was multi-purpose, and it seemed, some people, wasteful to build this one baseball stadium and one football stadium. It's understood now that's what you do, but it was a shock then. And one of our arguments was financial, which is, if we built a multi-purpose stadium for a then non-existent football team, and we never got one, we would have wasted $60 or $80 million in that structure and ended up with a building that was not suitable as well for baseball. So we tried to make that economic argument. And there was a Montgomery County senator who went around saying it was going to be an artificial turf stadium, which it was very clear that was never the intent. But so there were a lot of people who did some grandstanding in opposition to it. And it was hard. It was very hard. I mean, the debate was just a regular debate about public financing for a stadium.
And so you said earlier that Schaefer had those meetings with the legislators. What were those meetings like?
Well, usually kind of staff would be in there, Alan would be in there, or I would be in there, and we would have briefed the governor on what the position of the person, what their issues were, what their questions were, and we would try to get in there to the governor to say, usually to kind of look them in the eye and saying, I want this vote, I need your vote, it's the right thing to do. And most of the time he would have some kind of, we would do the pitch, and he would say, and they would be afraid. Some people would be very nervous to be in the presence of the governor, and they would say, fine. I wanted to mention the financing because it goes to one question. We struggled to come up with a financing option, and how are we going to pay for this $80-90 million stadium, not counting the land? And we looked at beer tax. Well, the idea was sports fans drink beer, so let's come up with a tax on beer. That didn't go anywhere. There's something called Program Open Space, which is a state program to create parkland, and we went, baseball parkland. That idea didn't go anywhere, but we came up with what eventually passed, which was the sports lottery. The idea to create this new lottery, instant scratch-off game, specifically dedicated financially to pay for the stadium, and it would have a sports theme. And that's essentially what got passed. Well, we're in one meeting with a state senator who, I'm ready for the governor to make the close. This is Senator so-and-so, and he's a little ambivalent on it. And Governor, we're here to kind of close the deal and why we need the vote. And the senator goes and says that he had religious opposition to gambling. And to my shock, the governor says, oh, okay, well, I highly respect that, never mind, and let him walk out. And we were like, we were stunned. We were, Governor, we needed that vote. And he goes, well, he said he had a religious opposition, so I wasn't going to press him. And that was the moment. I remember that. That was like, that's not the way this was supposed to happen. But usually the governor, especially people from Baltimore City, he made it very clear they were expected to vote for it because it was good. It was good for Baltimore City, but good for the Baltimore region. But again, that was an example where he did not do anything close to what we thought he was going to say.
So we've also heard that at the time there's a big deal with federal money. That, am I saying this right? There was like a lot of federal money, about like 450 rebate.
450 million.
Yeah, and federal money rebate that held up the legislature. Was that any of concern for you guys?
I'm not recalling that at all. Yeah, I'm not recalling that.
All right. So the other thing I want to ask was, how was it like kind of guiding Governor Schaefer around Annapolis? Because he'd been so entrenched in the Baltimore politics.
That's right. Yeah. Well, he was slow to understand the differences between the Baltimore City Council and the Maryland General Assembly. And the Maryland General Assembly was going to be much more independent than he was used to with the City Council. And the former state Senator Mike Miller from Prince George's County and President of the Senate, not then, but was very critical and said some really attacked Governor Schaefer for his failure to understand the independence of the Maryland General Assembly, and that was hard. I mean, it was he expected when he introduced the bill. The 22-member committee was going to pass 22-0, and sometimes it wouldn't pass, or sometimes it would pass 14-8 or something like that, and he did not do well, didn't accept that at first. It took him a while to really kind of learn the give and takes. He was expected to kind of give when I say jump, your question is how high, to the legislature, and it didn't happen like that, and there were some real stumbles. He made some comments, I think, that from time to time, as I recall, this is generally that the legislator did not take well to. So I mean, I thought he was a very, very successful governor, and I'm deeply fond of him. But that first year was a really hard learning curve for him in terms of how the legislature and the governor viewed their role under the Maryland Constitution.
So fast forward to 1987 in March, prior to the third Annapolis hearing.
That's it.
What was the feeling like around the Camden Yards bill? Was there like, oh my God, we're not going to pass this, or we got this? So, like, what was the feeling?
Well, we had two hearings before, and they had not gone well. They had been very, very rough, and Williams hadn't showed up for them. Williams was doing his coy thing, which is, I didn't ask for a new stadium. And so we're out there kind of kicking and screaming and trying to push and push and push, and there's no Edward Bell Williams. The Orioles were essentially silent. Now, we were hearing from Larry Lucchino, and he was talking to Alan, talking to me with his thoughts and so forth. But there was no Williams, and it was not, that was a really important thing. And I would say we were worried, especially because we knew we had to get past the Senate and the filibuster. I don't think we weren't despondent. We weren't at any point like this is going to fail, but there were points where we said this is not a good day. This has not been a good week. We're not making the progress we think we should make. No, there were some rough moments, and we certainly had some sweat out there in terms of what the next step was going to be.
And so, leading up to that hearing, it had been a couple days before Schaefer announced that out of the blue. Oh, actually, let me back up. Did Schaefer tell you in Rifkin prior that he would announce that Edward
Nope.
Bennett Williams?
No. So it was the Monday morning hearing. The hearing was, I think, a Wednesday evening. I think it was in the Senate combined Senate Finance Committee and Senate Budget and Taxation Committee in the joint hearing room. No Edward Bennett Williams scheduled. And Schaefer had every Monday morning, he had a regular press conference just on his entire legislative proposal. And again, I really want to emphasize on everything. And I think Alan and I would typically stand in the back when we were watching, and we suddenly realized that the governor has just announced that Edward Bennett Williams is going to appear at the Wednesday hearing. And Alan and I looked at each other, and I think we kind of took a deep breath and went, thought, this is really good news. We needed this. Waited for the hearing to end, ran up to the governor and said, Governor, that was outstanding. I don't know, what did you do? Did you talk to him? And I remember the quote. I hope I got it exactly right. It was, girls, you got a phone call to make. And that's when we realized that he had essentially just taken a gamble and made the announcement that Williams was coming. Now, Williams had cancer. And as it turned out, Williams was scheduled on Wednesday to be in Boston to get a chemotherapy session. And so I believe it was me who called Williams. I got the job of calling Edward Bennett Williams and telling him that the governor just announced that he was coming on Wednesday. And he was pissed. There were some foul words that were exchanged. I was yelled at by Edward Bennett Williams. Remember, I'm an attorney. I'm in my early 30s. And this is America's greatest trial attorney, the owner of the Orioles, former Oriole of the Washington Redskins. And so that was pretty intense. And then he did ask, well, what are they going to ask me? Which at the time I was kind of thought, I'm supposed to brief Edward Bennett Williams on what they're going to ask. So we agreed to get him some questions. And then we made it went all over Annapolis like wildfire that Williams is coming on Wednesday. And Mickey Steinberg was there, Ellen, and we were all like, okay, this is the game changer. This is what we've been waiting for. And then I remember I had to work on the questions, and I talked to a bunch of people, and we kind of kicked them around, and I ended up with a list of 22 questions. Essentially, why should the public pay for this thing? What's the kind of the financial commitment that the Orioles are going to make? They're just very technical questions. The design of what his thoughts were on the design of the new stadium. But everyone knew he had cancer, and this was the question everyone asked in impolite circles, like what happens after Edward Bennett Williams? So after a long debate, and we actually did collectively sit around and debate what I call question 22, which is, what happens to the Orioles when you die? And we typed it out, and we faxed it to Edward Bennett Williams, and the phone rang again. And he wanted to know, who the F had sent him these questions and what this is about. He was insulted. He was really angry. But we tied down the details, and he was going to arrive in kind of early afternoon. We would meet in the mansion for a small meeting to kind of prep. And then that evening we would have the hearing. And so, but I remember he was furious. And then it was when he flew into town from Boston on the Wednesday. We went to the mansion, and I think it was probably the governor, lieutenant governor, Allen, Herb Belgrad might have been there, and me. And I remember we're sitting around the table. Now, no one's ever met a lot of each other. And Williams says, "Who was the one who asked me that question?" And everyone points at me, just like that. So, so that was quite a moment when I had to say, "Mr. Williams, you wanted to be briefed, and I'm telling you, those are the questions you're going to be asked." And then we prepped, and then the hearing started. And I don't know how much you want to tell. You probably heard about the hearing, but I can go what I remember.
Yeah. So, first, what was that preparation like with Edward Bennett Williams? Like after the.
Oh, it was intense, but it was made real clear to him, and everyone said, that's one of the questions. You just came from a chemotherapy session. It's not a crazy question. And then but the question, are you prepared to sign a lease? If we build the stadium that you said you still haven't asked for, are you going to sign a lease for it? And his answer, I think, was good enough. And then we went to the joint hearing room. It was a long table. I was on the very end. And I think if you look at a lot of the video, I'm cut out of all the video because I was on the end. But I was there with my list of 22 questions. And it was, again, the Senate Budget and Taxation Committee and the Senate Finance Committee meeting jointly. And what I do recall very specifically, and I looked for the sheet of paper, but it must be archived with all my records. I just sat there and checked off the questions as they were asked. And of the 22 questions that I had sent to Edward Bennett Williams, 19 of them were asked, including by Senator Julian Lapidus of Baltimore City, what happens to the Orioles when you die? So he literally got the question in the public hearing. And he had an answer to it. But the dramatic moment was, you might have seen, if you've seen the video, when he pulls the magazine out. He pulls that Sports Illustrated out of his briefcase. And it has the 3 Ripkins in it. And he goes, this is what a major league team can mean for your city. And that was a real dramatic moment.
So after that hearing, what was the feeling just immediately after?
We felt good. We felt that the hearing had turned things around, that we had done what we needed to do. We had answered the questions, that everything was now in place to get the bill out of committee, deal with some amendments we would have to deal with, and hit the Senate floor.
So, did you ever interact with Edward Bennett Williams besides that Annapolis hearing?
Never again.
And what would be your lasting memory of him?
Well, again, as an attorney, he was respected as one of America's greatest trial attorneys, and an amazing record. Just regardless of sports ownership, he had just an incredible record as a trial attorney, representing clients of all sorts of controversies and getting them what they needed. So his kind of venture into sports was kind of from that perspective was interesting. But I never talked to him again, and he did not live that much longer. He did not live to see the new stadium built. He died, and it was bought by Eli Jacobs, and then Eli Jacobs did not have a long-term ownership either before Peter Angelos, who was at that time hailed as the local hero because he brought back Baltimore ownership as opposed to this out-of-state ownership that the city had experienced with Williams from D.C. and Jacobs from Brooklyn, I think.
So after the '87 hearing, moving into the lease negotiations, did you participate or have any knowledge of what the lease negotiations were like for Canyon Yards?
I was peripherally part of that. I was not at the table. Because I was in the legislative office, and it was really at that point the Stadium Authority, Herb Belgrad. They were doing the intense negotiations. So I was kind of very peripheral, very interested, and stayed on top of it and so forth. I did want to tell you one more story, but we beat the filibuster. There was a 3-day filibuster on the legislation, And it was finally like 3 o'clock in the morning on the third day is when the filibuster finally was broken. They got the 34th, 35th vote to break it. But again, at 3 o'clock in the morning, big relief, huge victory. We were excited. Next morning, I'm in the office and my phone rings. This is in the State House, and it's Larry Lucchino, who was then the president of the Orioles. And I'm presuming he's calling to say, "Congratulations, David. Thank you to the governor. Thank you all. This is wonderful." And the very first thing he says to me, and I'll never forget it, and Alan knows the same story, is, "You're going to build me a goddamn Yugo." That was a quote he said. And I was staring to the phone, not fully comprehending, but he was gone past the filibuster, gone past the vote. He was now into the design of the stadium. This was like 5 hours later, and was giving his thoughts that the stadium that had been, conceptually shown to the legislature was a, quote, plain, boring, unattractive, cheap thing. And that probably was the beginning of the migration of that design. And remember, there was no warehouse in the initial design. The warehouse, when we were in front of the legislature, there was no talk of the warehouse being kept. And that began that whole evolution that led into the famous Camden Yards design that we have today. But that was a quote from Larry Lucchino the morning after we broke the filibuster.
What was Larry Lucchino like?
He was a tough guy, and no, he was. There was not a lot of warm fuzziness. He was all business, and that was an example. I mean, I thought that was a pretty unsentimental phone call to make the next morning. Alan has told me that that they laugh about that now or something, because obviously the historic nature of the design changed everything.
What was Schaefer's relationship like with Lucchino?
I don't know that I have any information on that. I'm not sure I ever saw them interact.
So, what about, this is more about Schaefer. We've interviewed Kurt Schnook, the mayor.
No, yeah.
We've heard from him that they didn't talk for pretty much the entire 10 years.
Schaefer and Kurt, yeah.
Yeah, how did you view the dynamic between Mayor Schnook and...
Well, yeah, I liked Kurt. I thought he was very intelligent. I thought he was, but there was no doubt that Schaefer tended to not like anyone who had jobs he had either before or after him. He disliked Paris Glendening immensely, and would tell everyone in the world about it. He disliked Harry Hughes. I remember him cursing a portrait of Harry Hughes once. I remember literally standing in front of a portrait of Harry Hughes and cursing him. So he didn't, and that was one of the battles in the legislature, because the idea was Baltimore City was getting the stadium for nothing. And if you look at the final legislation that passed, one of the amendments that was taken was a requirement that Baltimore City contribute, I think it was at least $1 million a year toward the debt service for the stadium. And they had to agree to that. I think they knew that in the end all money was going to be fungible, and they sorted out. $1 million was not a big deal going forward. But that was one of the things that the city had to be on record as contributing to pay for debt service. But no, Schaefer was not fond of Kurt.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think Camden Yards was so important to him? Like, why specifically this stadium and just really the city of Baltimore?
Well, nothing was more important to William Bell and Schaefer than Baltimore City. And even as governor, it was very clear that was his priority. But I spent time talking to him even after he was in office about the loss of the Colts, and really, even when his memory was fading, he could give you word-for-word conversation that he had had with Irsay at the time when the Colts left, and you know the famous Mayflower story in the middle of the night. And other people told me what it was like the next few days in City Hall when they left. Schaefer was stung at a depth that I can't possibly explain by the loss of the Colts. It burned a hole in his psyche, and it changed him, I think, as a politician. And that was one of the things that drove him. It's not going to happen again. I'm not going to be the mayor governor that loses 2 major sports franchises. I am not going to let that happen. And I think that was a driving force. And he also believed that he was the guy. He was the guy who would suffer the loss under the Colts, and he was the guy who was going to keep the Orioles here. and no one else was going to get in the way of that at the end of the day. And that was personal to him.
So, moving forward, we interviewed Bruce Hoffman last week.
Oh, one of my heroes. I think Bruce is a terrific man.
And he said he had a story about the stadium being over budget in around 1989. As soon as he got there, that he went to Schaefer. Him and Herb Belgrad had a meeting with Schaefer. They had to tell him that they were $30 million over budget in order to build the stadium. Schaefer yelled at them, and he's like, "I'll go get you the money." They got the money next Monday, $34 million. Do you know any of that, like getting the money of $34 million allocating to the stadium?
Well, I think what's funny about that story is if you look at all the press at the time, the idea was the stadium was built on budget, and that was kind of that maintained all along that that there was kind of a tough time in the national economy. The construction costs were down, and they got some real breaks, and were able to build. The contractors wanted to be in on it, so they got a good price. So the idea that the stadium was over budget is actually not something that was discussed back then at all. Certainly not publicly in any way.
So, moving towards opening day.
Oh yeah.
What was the talk like leading up to opening day? What was the focus?
Incredible excitement. Laney LeBeau, who had been was very close to the governor, had an event a couple days before called the Baseball, and it was a black tie event held in the stadium before it opened. And they had on the screen the famous James Earl Jones speech from Field of Dreams, and it was an amazing event. So there was incredible celebration leading up to it. I remember the Today Show did a special from the outfield. I think Yogi Berra might have been there, the national television was in Baltimore for the opening of Camden Yards, because it was viewed as a revolutionary change in design. You've seen the history. There's a book, by the way, I think it's called. Well, it's about every stadium ever built in America, and it's in 3 chapters. The first chapter deals with kind of the stadiums that are designed like Wrigley Field and Fenway. Then the middle one is what he calls the concrete donuts, very critical of the multi-purpose stadiums. And the third chapter is essentially called the Camden Yards invention. Essentially, they credit the design of Camden Yards for changing baseball stadium architecture forever. Now, obviously, you have some dome stadiums now that have changed that even further, but it was considered this whole retro design look with the warehouse being kept was something completely unknown to baseball, and it changed baseball. If you look at Texas and Cleveland and Detroit and Philadelphia, these are all Camden Yard designs. So there was a realization that something really great had happened, and I know President Bush was scheduled to attend, and I was chief legislative officer by that point. Alan had gone to private practice. I was chief legislative officer. I was heavily identified in Annapolis. I've kind of been very passionate about the stadium, but the opening day was sine die. And sine die is the last day of the 90-day session. And if you're chief legislative officer in charge of getting the governor's legislation through the legislature, there is no day that is more important than the last day of the session, because you've got probably half of your package is still pending. So I wasn't planning on going to opening day. And again, I was closely identified and had worked with it in all the years. And there were amendments that had to go through the legislature as the bill, as the thing progressed. And so I just remember everyone was just giddy with excitement on that day. And it was interesting, one of the governor's photographers found out that I wasn't going to opening day. And he arranged for a police vehicle to pick me up and drive me to the stadium and back. And I might get there for 3 or 4 innings, and it was kind of in the afternoon, and a lot of people were kind of ducking out. And I did, about 2 o'clock, 1 o'clock, I don't remember what it was, I run under the State House steps, there's a vehicle going to me, we haul ass up to Baltimore, drop me off at the front door, I go in, I'm in the governor's box, president's next door. And everyone told me if I wanted to get back to Annapolis quickly, I had to leave before President Bush left, because that would shut down the stadium for security reasons. So I'm literally watching the game and watching the president, make sure he hasn't left yet. And I bolt and I get in the car and drive back, and I was probably gone for maybe 2 hours, but I got to be there on opening day, which was great.
What was your reaction to the stadium full of fans?
Well, we've been there many times. We've been there during the construction. I went to the last game at Memorial Stadium where they had a huge ceremony. I don't know if you've seen the film of that. They had all the players in all the different positions. The limousine comes around, it digs up home plate, puts in the back of the limousine. They drive downtown and they plant it in the under construction site. And I've been there. I had toured the stadium a number of times when it was this steel. I remember climbing this crazy wooden ladder up to what was the club level when it was literally a steel structure at that point, and that was a very dumb thing to do, by the way, because I had to get down. I hadn't planned on the getting down part. And then we'd had all sorts of chances for kind of special tours of the clubhouse when it was under construction. So we'd spent a lot of time in the building as it was going through the construction phase, and had seen it come together, and it was watching it was like really cool. This is much more beautiful than we thought, and the idea they kept the warehouse, that was no one thought about that when the legislation passed. No one thought about the warehouse when that legislation passed. I really want to emphasize that.
What were your thoughts on the warehouse?
Oh, I thought it was great. It was good. I thought it was absolutely terrific that they saved it. I'll also tell you a story. There was a big debate about the name of the stadium. And I did spend a lot of time with Schaefer on this. Angelos wanted Baltimore, wanted Oriole Park. We all wanted Camden Yards. We just thought Camden Yards was a really cool name. And I talked to the governor about this many times. The staff all wanted it. And he would say, David, he goes, it's, Peter's really digging in. And I said, Governor, come on, you can, fight on it.
Was it Peter Angelos?
Peter Angelos, yeah.
Eli Jacobs at the time for the stadium?
No, at that point, I think it was Peter.
I think it was Eli.
Was Eli still there?
I think it was Eli Jacobs, because he was there as opening day.
All right, well, okay. What I remember is the Orioles came up with there was a compromise reached, and it was going to say Oriole Park at Camden Yards, and the Orioles did a sign, the first sign, and we saw it. This was after Schaefer had kind of backed off a little, that it was going to be Camden Yards alone, and the sign that they designed had Oriole Park at Camden Yards. And we went, no, that's not it. So if you look at the sign there now, they're equal size typeface on the top of the stadium. Camden Yards and Oriole Park are equal. And that was something that we pushed hard for.
So we heard from Alan Rifkin that he sensed that Schaefer wanted the stadium named after himself. Did you feel that way also?
No, never.
So after the whole naming stuff, on opening day, we've heard from Kurt Schmoke and other people that traffic was the other big concern.
Yeah, it had been.
Was Schaefer at all concerned about traffic?
I think he didn't think that was his problem. He thought it was going to be a great location, and that the traffic would have more alternatives to kind of dissipate from the stadium because of the city grid than if you were in a suburban location with a kind of central parking lot and a highway. So I actually think he thought the city was going to be better for a traffic perspective. There was no light rail there at the time either, by the way. I don't think a light rail had opened yet. It was probably pretty close. No, that was not a burning concern. It was this is the right location, and people will get there. Now remember, there was a sea of parking because there was no football stadium, which became a later controversy when the football stadium got built. The Orioles got very upset about losing those parking spaces, and at one point pressed very hard for like a 4,800 car parking garage to be built to replace the parking loss for now the football stadium. And I was working for Glendenning at that point when that came up.
And for the design of the stadium, who would you say should get credit for the design of the stadium?
Well, I'm well aware that Janet Marie Smith? Is worked on stadiums, Fenway, and all around the country. And and she's given an enormous amount of credit. I always thought that Bruce Hoffman probably should get a little more credit as well, but kind of his role. But certainly the Orioles were a driving force in some of the aesthetic decisions. I know there's a debate about who came up with the idea of keeping the warehouse, and I don't have any inside information on that at all. I've heard it was a graduate student. If you read some of the stories and articles written, there's some graduate student who's named as the first one to suggest that. And by the way, that was also viewed as kind of a cost-saving thing, that they could put the Oriole offices that otherwise they would have had to build into the stadium. They could save money by having the baseball operations and executives' offices in the warehouse.
So, what about just the stadium Camden Yards? Who do you think should get credit just for the stadium itself?
The location?
Just the entirety of it.
Well, I think Schaefer has to be identified as the one who really drove the decision to put a baseball-only stadium in downtown Baltimore, with the Baltimore Orioles management, everyone from Williams and Jacobs. I think Jacobs had some. I remember he was very influential on I think the right field wall with the scoreboard reminded him of Ebbets Field in Brooklyn. I think there was that kind of. There were different things that were taken. So a lot of people had design on it. Janet Murray Smith obviously gets a lot of credit for it, but I think the Maryland Stadium Authority needs to be acknowledged for their great leadership. They were named the Stadium Authority to build a baseball stadium. Their legacy is to build facilities all around the state in all sorts of different issues, including an office building in downtown Annapolis right now. And so that is a highly regarded organization, and their legacy has gone far beyond the building of a baseball stadium and a football stadium.
So I just have a couple more questions. I think Sandy will have a couple of questions. This one you might not have heard about, but I wonder, just because we've heard this before, that I don't know if Schaefer ever mentioned this again, but I think this is before you worked for him, but there's a meeting with Schaefer, Art Modell, and Edward Bennett Williams around 1985, right after the Colts had left, somewhere along, like an airfield along I-95. We heard this from Bob Flanagan. And it was a meeting that was never reported, but it was them trying to figure out how to get a stadium back in Maryland, right after the Colts had left. And it was their thinking of putting a stadium somewhere along I-95. Did he ever mention that again? It's kind of a side.
Well, I know again there was an I-95. I said kind of Laurel. I talked about it. There was there's a large plot of land up there called Conterra, and that might have been identified at one point as a stadium location between the two cities, because the Orioles were starting to really draw heavily from the D.C. area after the Senators had left. So I'm not aware of the meeting, but I am aware that an I-95 location had been actively discussed at one point. In the end, it was not even close. It was Lansdowne or Camden Yards, and that was not even given any consideration. But certainly at one point there were speculation about that.
It was prior to 87, or I guess up to 87, was there a real did you or the governor's office feel that there's a real threat that the Orioles would leave Baltimore?
I believe it was a common fear among people in the Baltimore area that with a Washington, D.C. owner, no baseball team in Washington, D.C., that the Orioles could be relocated. And he made it very clear how unhappy he was with the Memorial Stadium. While it was 55,000 people and they were drawing heavily, one of the things, a lot of the amenities were just completely lacking. The restrooms were famous for a level of disgust you can't even describe on camera. And then the design of it, and what baseball was moving toward from an economic standpoint was relying more on season ticket holders who would be there for 81 games or a large package. And so the idea was and then the idea of club seats and the skyboxes, which could not really be accommodated at Memorial Stadium. There was much more revenue identified with the skyboxes, the club level, and the season ticket holders. And in every one of those measures, Memorial Stadium was not going to work. So and there were a lot of studies about retrofitting Memorial Stadium, and they just, none of them said it was never going to work. It was never going to be there. So there was deep nervousness, again, a community completely traumatized by the loss of the Baltimore Colts. Washington, D.C. owner of the Baltimore Orioles, and no lease longer than 1 year, very much concerned that the Orioles could have relocated.
Sandy, if you have a couple of questions.
Yeah, just a couple. The 395, essentially the ramp off of 95, was that created for the stadiums?
Okay, yeah, I can answer that.
Right off of Martin Luther King there.
Yeah, yeah. So, because Rifkin made a reference that, as you said, light rail didn't exist when
Yeah.
the stadium opened, and there was no access off 95 necessarily. So was that a plan?
Well, I'm not going to be 100% certain in my answer, but the answer was, I think the answer is yes. The transportation improvements that were intentionally not included in the Stadium Authority's budget were designed to deal with the access to the site. So I think it is very probable that that ramp was created just for the stadium infrastructure of potentially the two stadiums. It can't be 100% certain, but there was a lot of, if you look at the budgets back then, there was a lot of money in the Maryland Department of Transportation's budget to accommodate these new stadiums at that location.
And did you ever talk with Lucchino about the design? Because you say he called and said, what a great quote, you've given me a goddamn Yugo. Do you guys know what a Yugo is?
No.
Cheap little car.
Okay.
It was built in Yugoslavia under this when Yugoslavia was still under the Soviet Union. I know I'm dating myself, you guys have to look this up. And it was literally their parts of the car was built out of cardboard. It was a very cheap car. They actually tried to sell it in the United States, and it was selling for like $1,200, $1,500, $1,800 at a time when a normal car would cost $7,000, $8,000, $9,000. Remember at the time. So it was famous for breaking down terribly. So it's the epitome of the cheapest, least reliable car you can think. And from a design standpoint, it looked horrible. I mean, it was just like, are you kidding me? So that was you're going to build me a goddamn Yugo. And I never had another conversation with Larry Lucchino again. That was the one time he called and gave me his earful. And again, what changed over time, they brought in Janet Marie Smith, the Stadium Authority was created, Bruce Hoffman is there. There's extensive design collaboration between the Orioles and the Stadium Authority, and of course, Stadium Authority representing kind of Schaefer's ideas. The warehouse comes in design. I remember one of the big decisions was use of steel versus a concrete. And the idea, if you look at Memorial Stadium back then, it was these massive concrete pillars with rebars and so forth. And that's how they structurally held up the stadium. And the idea was to go for steel was much more expensive. And there's a number in my head that it cost $7 million more to go with the steel that you see, the painted green steel you'll see right now at Camden Yards. So that was to go and capture the retro look. If you looked at Fenway and look at Wrigley and some of the older stadiums, that's how they were built. So those type of design elements had a serious cost consequence, but were part of the look that they went for, the retro look.
So you kind of answered my question. Lucchino calls and yells at you. Did you, at that point, you were not able to say, relax, you'll get the stadium you want?
Well, I wasn't in that position. That's just, I wasn't in that position.
Right.
There are other people who do that. I remember being kind of astounded by the comment. Frankly, I was a little offended. I thought, given what we've just been through, a thank you might have been a good way to start this conversation. But at the same time, I heard it, I registered, and I passed it on, and I probably then moved to the next bill on my desk that I had to work, because Camden Yards was now had passed almost. There were still some last-minute things that had to go to the House and Senate and sort it out. But I had other things I probably had a hearing that afternoon on a completely different piece of legislation. We were in conversations with Bruce Hoffman all the time. And I was not in a decision-making role at that point. I was in the legislative office, but I was still kind of involved and supportive and tried to help out wherever I could.
So that was Lucchino and the architects, I guess, then, that came up with the design. You never heard again from...
I know I was aware of working with Mark Wasserman and some of the others of the dynamics that were going on that led to the design. And remember, there was a long period of time between the passage of the legislation and the groundbreaking. It was probably, I don't know, 18 months or so. I don't have the exact number ahead. And during that whole time, there were just, I remember walking around the warehouse with Bruce Hoffman and some of the others, and Janet Marie Smith went, and they were trying to choose the brick that they were going to use to fill in different places and do some repairs to the warehouse. And the warehouse was under construction at the same time to do the renovations.
One last thing, could you describe again, as you described at the beginning, that whole, I don't know, that whole legislative session where the stadium package was top of everybody's list, and you're dealing with recalcitrant legislators, and Edward Bennett Williams isn't playing ball. What a terrible pun. And so what's the mood in the State House there? What were you feeling as you thought these bills have got to cross the finish line?
Well, that session was important. It was brand new for me from our career standpoint. I'd gone from being a legislative staffer, where my opinion really didn't matter. I was kind of the technician, the legal technician, to being one of the governor's 4 legislative policy analysts, and my job was to be an advocate for the governor, which I really loved making that transition, but it was new for me. It was exhilarating to work for this new governor who had been overwhelmingly elected by landslide proportions that change any understanding of a landslide contemporary. And then he had a very aggressive legislative package, and Camden Yards was one of them. But I think from the very beginning, I understood that the Camden Yards was going to be the defining part of his session. I have an award that was given to all of us at the end of that session, and I think Alan Rifkin, and it was the Ivory Soap Award. 99.9% pure. It was like the governor had like 99% passage rate. So there was excitement, but it was also this new governor who was very clearly not all that comfortable in his new role, who was having his own adjustments, didn't really buy into this idea that there was an independent legislature that was going to have its chance to do its own stamp on the legislation, and that they weren't immediately saying yes when he would ask them to do things. That it took a while for him to go through that, and we're all adjusting to these new roles. And there were other issues facing the state at the time in a wide variety of areas, from economic development to health. I think to remember the organization of state government was a real big deal, and there was some major legislation that went through to create new departments, which was very important to everybody. But Camden Yards clearly was the high-profile legislation, and from my personal perspective, it was one of the most exciting times of my career. I was a joke. I was paid to talk about baseball for about a year and a half. That was my job, was to talk about baseball finances, and that was a lot of fun. But it was a very very challenging time for everyone because of adjusting to new roles and the need to get things done with a governor who was very demanding. Do it now. Don't delay. Don't give me an excuse. Don't tell me you can't do it. There may be 9 reasons why you can't do something. I want to hear the one way that you can do it. And that was something that's really defined my management experience well. All right, there's 9 reasons we can't do that. But is there one that we can? Let's talk about that. Let's explore that one. That was a really important part of it. But yeah, getting through the filibuster, the drama of Williams, and then getting to the end of session. But there was a lot of exhilaration and excitement, and I'm very proud of how it turned out in the end, obviously.
All right. I think we're all finished up here.